Good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. People are still kind of trickling in, but we will. Just like the trains, we are going to start right on time, every time. So, welcome to the infrastructure plenary session. My name is Nichols with the National Energy Technology Laboratory. I'll be moderating the session. We'll introduce our esteemed panel as they come up to present. Let me just give you a little background, just a little snippet of what we'll be talking about today. The infrastructure of America's energy, it consists of millions of miles of pipelines, railways, and electricity lines, serves a vital role in the transmission, storage, and delivery of the nation's energy. But for such an important piece of the economy, it's not in such great shape. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave the U.S. a grade of D+ in the energy infrastructure category. They rated the overall U.S. infrastructure in terms of bridges and highways, I think, at a D overall, so I'm not sure if they're just looking for more work or if they really feel that. But there are significant issues. I think Bill especially will tell us how old all of the infrastructure is that we rely on. In fact, from the Quadrennial Energy review that he'll be discussing, there's a nice quote that says there's been a lack of timely investment in refurbishing, replacing, and modernizing components of energy infrastructure that are simply old or obsolete. So if you think about our 100-ish quad energy economy, virtually every piece of that energy has to go through some sort of this energy infrastructure, unless you are producing and consuming that energy on site. So something like solar cells at your house, that all of the energy that we use has to go through this infrastructure at some point. So I already used my Back to the Future reference yesterday, and I'll bring it up again. So we all have Mr. Fusions installed in our houses and DeLoreans. You know, we're going to need to use this system of pipes and wires to keep us in the energy. So this panel will discuss different perspectives from across a variety of energy delivery modes. We'll go ahead and jump right into it with William F. Hederman. He's the Deputy Director for Systems Integration and Senior Analyst and Secretary of Energy. Mr. Hederman is a trained electrical engineer and public policy analyst with decades of executive experience in the private and public sectors. He began his professional career as a systems integration engineer at Bell Labs in the directorate that later developed the cell phone system. Mr. Hederman served on the RAND Corporation's research team that pioneered analysis of federal technology demonstrations, worked as the Congressional Budget Office's first energy and science budget analyst, and led the establishment of the Policy Analysis Department at INGA, the International Energy Agency's Gas Technology Center, and of the Washington office of R.J. Rudden Associates, now Black & Veatch. So, Bill, come on up.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, as Chris Reed said, I realize it explains my aged infrastructure. I'm delighted to be here today, and the Quadrennial Energy Review is a real legacy priority for Secretary Moniz. He basically wanted to change the way that energy policy was happening. And he literally said, you know, there are a lot of things that have happened over the last couple of decades. I feel like somebody woke up in the morning and while they were shaving, said, you know, we should do this. And he wanted to move to really institutionalizing the idea of evidence-based decision making. And that's a big part of what this is about. The tradition doesn't go back very far, but it goes back into the late 1900s with the Quadrennial Defense Review, where the defense establishment said, what is it we really need to be ready to deal with? You know, it was major conflicts on 2 continents, other, you know, miscellaneous efforts, and even that sort of thing is revisited then every 4 years. So the idea here was to create a strategic analytic effort that would come to conclusions. The concept is ultimately, it's probably every 4 years, but as we started and he wanted to get the ball rolling quickly, we got the first one done in 1.5 years, and we focused on transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. The thinking being, as Chris mentioned, everything has to use some of this. Let's look at that, then we'll figure out what part to look at in the next installment. So that's how this got started. It came out last spring, and I'll give you the link at the end, but if you take a look at it, especially for this group, dive into the library of other materials. We got an immense and rich set of information from stakeholders from all elements of energy activities, and you can probably find lots of good stuff to do analysis on. So I think we've heard about a lot of this in pieces over the last couple of days, but it's just worth bringing all together. The change in the energy world, especially in North America, that has happened in the last 10 years is just astounding. We've got increased energy production in gas and oil and in renewables. Distributed energy is beginning to take off, and efficiencies have been improving as well. Technology advances that have made that happen include the solar, the wind, the demand-side software, and the fracturing. Policy developments have also affected how the markets work. And we heard some comments about that you can't always rely on a market, and you got to do some other things. So the corporate average fuel efficiency standards have made a big difference on the consumption of gasoline. The Clean Air Act, with the Clean Power Plan, it's certainly going to affect what happens going forward. I don't think we know for sure how yet. Clean Water Act, renewable fuels, the RPS standards, and the regional carbon markets such as RGGI all have effects. Most of the things I just mentioned are fairly positive. I, of course, need to mention as well some negative things. On the energy security side, we face much more serious challenges and dangers than we thought. The evidence of cyber attack on all aspects of our infrastructure are quite alarming. We are making serious progress on it, but the extent of those attacks by all sorts of bad guys are something that now needs serious investment to deal with. And the climate issues and certainly the incidents of extreme weather have shown that we do have vulnerabilities and need for hardening of infrastructure and so forth. On the other hand, imports have declined. Another important issue is our allies. We look at the G7 now, and just the fact that it's G7 and not G8 tells you that the world isn't as happy a place as it was not too long ago. And our allies are looking to us to be part of their solutions. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on this slide, so don't get too worried if I've been here 10 minutes and I'll be going through the rest pretty quickly. But this is the core of the Quadrennial Energy Review. It was an attempt to try to capture the whole framework in one slide. You also could teach a course on how not to provide a PowerPoint slide as a slide. But it was the output of a lot of effort by a lot of agencies to try to get everything everybody cared about in one picture. So it's called the flower diagram, give you a little inside baseball. And I think the core thing is the outer perimeter. So there are 3 national policy goals that we think any energy policy needs to be considering. It's economic and economic competitiveness in particular, energy security, and environmental responsibility. And some measures can deal with all of these, and others involve trade-offs. So you need to take account of that as you look at each measure. You know, an improvement in the efficiency with which we use energy probably is a positive factor for all of these, unless it's very costly, but if it's a low-cost solution. On the other hand, when we have to make the investment in energy security, we're probably harming economic competitiveness because it's going to be a cost that we didn't have before. Within the security, we include a lot of concepts. You know, we include the idea that was once called energy independence, a term we try to avoid because it causes a lot of confusion and you never need to be totally independent. Whereas it's where we would address infrastructure reliability and resilience, and resilience to all those forms of attacks. And there have not only been cyber attacks, but there have been some physical attacks of note also, some of which you probably heard about, others maybe not. On the area of the new infrastructure, though, if you look at the bullseye of this diagram, I mean, that was the point of this review, which was we need to move our energy infrastructure to a level of performance that can serve this country for the rest of this century. Because by the time we get it in place, it's easily we're at 2030. It's going to last at least 50 years, we hope. And so that was the concept. We lay out what we think are the performance characteristics that you need to have for going forward. And I won't be able to go into the details of that, but look at the report. And the idea was that we want to enable the new efficiencies, the new environmental performance and so forth. And so that was the core of where we were trying to get. If you go to 12 o'clock on the dial, you see how these things were going to be put into place. And so it's increasing the resilience. You know, the Sandy stories come up all the time as the model of why we have to address this. Reliability issues, safety. Safety doesn't always get mentioned as much in the policy discourse as it does in industry, and it really always needs to be there and the reason it doesn't get mentioned, I think, is a positive one, that we assume that the systems will be safe. Second, if you move over to 3 o'clock on the dial there, modernizing the electric grid just constantly came up. It's the smart grid issues. It's not only at the distribution level, but at the transmission level. It's finding a way to deal with intermittency. Energy storage, of course, is the hoped-for solution, and making the investments to make sure that happens is key. Down at 6 o'clock, you see modernizing the U.S. energy security infrastructure. And there are several important parts of that. Probably the most important one requiring immediate attention is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This was a massive investment, began by the U.S. in the 1970s in response to the oil embargoes. We have about 700 million barrels in storage in the Gulf Coast region. This oil was so the type of oil and the location of it. It was put there so that if there were an interruption, that oil could literally flow to the refineries rather than flowing the oil that would have been imported to those same locations. But as we've had this incredible success on producing our own oil, and our own oil tends to be light and sweet, the oil that is in the reserve is the same, and what the refineries have kind of evolved into using is more heavy and sour because of the supply sources. And so we need to figure out what to do about this. You know, one question will be, what's the right level in the current situation? Another is, the law says that we cannot export this oil. Again, the mindset at the time was, this is for us, it's our part of being in the international agreements to have strategic reserves, but this oil stays in the U.S. That would be the worst way to use it right now. It really needs to get out on the water, and once the global market for oil is really very much a fluid international market, and it will help us just as much to get it where it physically is somewhere else, as long as we have what we physically need. So this is something that we expect to see both executive and legislative policymakers be revisiting. And then at 9 o'clock you see the idea of shared transport infrastructure. This was really a new concept that emerged out of the work we were doing related to the movement of Bakken crude. So the Bakken crude in North Dakota needed to get either to a refinery or on a boat and to another country and to their refineries. And there wasn't adequate pipeline infrastructure to move it, and the railroad industry came to serve this market need, and the railroads have taken this on, and then typically if it moves on rail, it also needs to move on a barge to get to the refinery, and that movement has caused all sorts of other repercussions through the system, and I'll talk with you about that a little bit. But so that's the big picture here. All of this is in much more detail in the report. It's a couple of 300 pages maybe, and it's a fascinating read, but you will have to read it. Nobody has negotiated for the movie rights yet. So let's look at some of the vulnerabilities that we're talking about. So this diagram, it makes kind of an interesting point, which is there are regional concentrations of the different kinds of problems that arise, whether it's the wildfires that can threaten overhead transmission lines, earthquakes, which can affect a lot of things. By the way, as you look at earthquakes, one of the more dangerous earthquakes would be on the New Madrid Fault, which is in the Midwest, and that's a serious potential danger as well. Interestingly, in rainfall, it appears that there is a shift in the pattern in that very heavy storms are delivering more rain, and we certainly see that in anecdotal ways recently. There's concern, especially in the Gulf, about sea level rise, and that threatens a lot of infrastructure that's in place already. And this last picture makes a point of billion-dollar disaster events, and you can see the pattern that this has tended to increase. A very fair point to bring up on this is that Part of that is due to the weather patterns, but part of it is due to the fact that there are a lot more McMansions on the sand dunes at the beach, etc. So, this is not just evidence of a change in the weather patterns. On electricity, the issue there is that there will be a need for significant investments. I think what's interesting, if you look at the drivers of investment in the recent past, reliability is the dominant one. Renewables integration, so connecting the wind sources that are far from market is the next largest contributor. And then economics, mostly around the least cost dispatch. And if we look at the pipeline infrastructure, and I'm not going to get into that much because I'm sure Don will cover that. It's just been remarkable how the existing pipeline networks, oil and gas, have been able to respond to these major changes. If you've been to any of the gas discussions, we literally, the gas used to move from the Gulf of Mexico up to New York. Now it's getting ready to be moving from Pennsylvania to the Gulf of Mexico. There was a big effort to get a line from the Rockies to Ohio, and now it's moving gas out of Ohio. I mean, just remarkable flexibility that has been able to be successfully driven by market signals and the regulations already in place for this. So the rail story. The Baca crude is up there in North Dakota. You see that little set of red dots in the upper left. Go to the lower left. Those were all the additional points where crude oil traffic were taking place. If you look at the upper right, you see the immense increase in rail cars, and that's a very good indicator of the volume that moved. And this is quarterly data, so I mean this really happened from 2010 until 2014. And the other important point there is in the lower right, which is that coal moved from the Powder River Basin to a lot of the same marketplaces. And so there became serious conflict between the movement of coal and the movement of oil on the rail lines because they only could move so many unit trains. And became a problem on a few occasions where actually FERC had to have some hearings on the matter because the coal piles were getting down to levels that caused reliability concerns. Okay, the other important point that I know we all know here is that the market signals make things happen. So I'll just point out two things. If you look at the line that really dips in 2007, that was the low value of natural gas out of the Rockies. When the Rockies Express got built, that came right in line with the national numbers. When you look out to 2014 and carries into 2015, New England is the outlier. New England doesn't have enough pipeline capacity to serve its needs. They've been able to live with occasional winter price spikes, and that's a story that continues. They are living with that by use of alternative fuels and by LNG deliveries in at Canterport and off Boston. So one other point about Boston that came up in this study was the methane emissions issue. There was a special roundtable set of discussions linked to the QER that addressed emissions. The natural gas industry has said we know that we should be part of the solution. We are part of the solution, and so they were very collaborative in these discussions to come up with ways to deal with this issue. It tends to be an issue in old distribution systems. Many of them have lines that are over 100 years old. The look at the far right, you see the years of the rate at which the replacement was taking place, and it exceeded 50 years in some places. We made recommendations about how to accelerate that. So let me just finish up by mentioning a couple of the recommendations. The grid modernization is a big one, the strategic petroleum reserve is another big one, and trying to help deal with the funding required to upgrade the infrastructure in the gas distribution systems is another. Take a look at the report. Here's a web link, basically energy.gov/QBR, and be happy to hear your reactions when you look at the report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. I think one of the great points you made was, no one's going to be making pipelines in a movie anytime soon. This is not something that the public really gets excited about, and investment in the infrastructure is not something that's an easy sell, but it's vitally important. So I think that was a good point. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Donald Santa. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Interstate National Gas Association of America, INGA, the North American Association representing the interstate and interprovincial natural gas pipeline industry. Don brings an extensive background in government and energy industry. He served as Majority Counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. He was nominated in 1993 to be a member of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he served until 1997. Upon leaving the government, he joined LG&E Energy Corp in Louisville, Kentucky. And then from there, he was a partner in the Washington, D.C. office law firm Troutman Sanders. He's a graduate of the Columbia University School of Law and Duke University Trinity School of Arts and Sciences. So, Don, your slides queued up here.
Great, well, thank you, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you this morning. As Bill said, I'm going to talk about primarily about natural gas transmission pipeline infrastructure, which was one of the key parts of the U.S. energy infrastructure network. The U.S. network of natural gas transmission pipelines, I think would be fair to say, is the envy of the world. This network of over 300,000 miles of natural gas transmission pipelines facilitates the very robust and competitive natural gas commodity market that we've got in the U.S. Of that 300,000 miles, some 220,000 miles are interstate natural gas pipelines, and the majority of the owners and operators of those pipes are members of INGA. And then the remainder are intrastate pipelines. Some of them upstream of the interstate pipelines and some of them downstream integrated as part of local distribution company networks. In addition, upstream there are some 17,500 miles of natural gas gathering lines, and downstream of the natural gas transmission network there are some 1.25 million miles of smaller diameter natural gas distribution pipelines. This network has many connections with our neighbors to the north and the south. There are some 31 connections with interprovincial pipelines in Canada. And as a practical matter, the U.S. and Canadian pipeline infrastructure and commodity markets are pretty integrated, really function as a single market. There also are growing points of interconnection to the south with Mexico. There's some 17 pipeline interconnections with Mexico, and that number is growing rapidly as U.S. pipeline exports to Mexico, pipeline gas exports to Mexico are a growing story. Also, while it's not INGA's function, or INGA's focus, let me talk just briefly about oil pipelines. According to our counterparts at the Association of Oil Pipelines, there were some 192,000 miles of liquids pipeline operating in the U.S. in 2013, and that network is growing. Total liquids pipeline mileage has grown by over 16,000 miles in the last 5 years. Let me now talk a little bit about the structure of the gas industry and the pipeline network. First thing I want to mention is that this is an industry that has never been a vertically integrated industry. So it has never been like the super major oil companies that are integrated from production, refining, downstream to distribution, gas stations, whatever. It's never been like the traditional electric utilities that have everything from generation, transmission, distribution. Interstate pipelines have been purely transporters of natural gas for over 20 years now. As part of the restructuring of the gas industry that began in the early 1980s and continued up to the early 1990s, pipelines left the merchant function. Historically, the pipelines would purchase gas upstream, aggregate that supply, resell it downstream to local distribution companies. The industry restructuring, pipelines got out of that and are purely transporters. Let's only talk a little bit about natural gas storage. Storage typically is underground. It's in formations that are either depleted oil and natural gas fields, aquifers, or in some cases salt domes. Storage depends very much upon the geology of a region and whether it is suited to storage. So for example, New England does not have a geology that is suitable to natural gas storage, and that exacerbates some of the problems of that market that Bill referenced in his talk. Also, in addition to delivering natural gas to local distribution companies, interstate natural gas pipelines often deliver gas directly to large industrial gas users and also in many cases directly to electric generators. I think this also is a good place to talk briefly about the demand for natural gas and demand drivers. Roughly speaking, the end-use market for natural gas in the United States is divided into thirds. Looking at some of the most recent data, about 31% of that end-use market is residential and commercial customers. In other words, the customers that are served by local distribution companies. A growing percentage, and now up close to 33% of end use, is electric generation. And then that final rough third is industrial consumption of natural gas, which now stands at about 28%. The remainder is accounted for in pipeline use of gas to fuel compressor engines, and also upstream use at the wellhead, and also in the processing. Over time, it's anticipated that electric generation use will continue to grow, and also to the extent that you count it as an end use, natural gas exports in the form of liquefied natural gas transported by tanker ship, and also those pipeline gas exports in Mexico are going to become a small but growing slice of that pie of where does the natural gas production go. Overall, U.S. gas consumption is growing. In 2014, the U.S. consumed 26.7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's up almost 3 trillion cubic feet per year over 2009, where it was 23.9 TCF, and a dramatic change from the mid-1980s, when domestic consumption of natural gas in 1983 shrunk to about 16.8 TCF. So it is a growing market. As I'm sure you all know now that you're at the third day of this conference in Pittsburgh, in the heart of the Marcellus, that the big natural gas story is the mighty Marcellus and its rapidly growing little brother, Utica Shale. Together, the Marcellus and Utica shales accounted for 85% of the growth of U.S. shale production since 2012. And shale gas production now accounts for 56% of total U.S. natural gas production, and that continues to grow. As Bill noted, this has had a dramatic effect on pipeline flows in the United States, and for that matter, in the U.S. and Canada. The historic flows were from the producing regions, primarily in the Gulf Coast and the Mid-Continent, and then to some extent the Rockies, to the major consuming markets, and particular markets in the Midwest, and then markets in the Mid-Atlantic and the East Coast. Also, Canadian production supplemented U.S. production. As a matter of fact, in the 1990s, it was Canadian production growth that really allowed for the growth of the U.S. market. That was primarily production coming out of the Western Sedimentary Basin in Canada, primarily in Alberta. Well, that has all changed with the Marcellus, with the fact that we now have got so much gas on the doorstep of the market. And it's interesting, several years ago, before we fully appreciated the magnitude of Marcellus, a acquaintance of mine who's a consultant to the gas industry said something to the effect of, the value of a pipeline is moving a commodity from point A to point B. What happens when point A moves to point B? And the point that he was making was that if you had a pipeline that the function was bringing gas from the Mid-Continent or the Gulf Coast to the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast, and all of a sudden there's this tremendous supply of gas sitting on the doorstep of the Northeast, what happens to the value of that pipeline capacity going from the Mid-Continent to the Gulf Coast to the Northeast? And of course, the concern there was that the pipelines would be stuck with a tremendous amount of underutilized pipeline capacity because of what had happened in the market. Well, lo and behold, because of the fact that the Marcellus and now the Utica are so prolific, that pipeline capacity that was historically moving gas from point A to point B is now going to be moving gas from point B to point A. And what we're seeing, and Bill referenced it, is a lot of pipeline reversals, where you're seeing pipes that historically took the gas from the southwest up to the northeast, now taking gas down to the southeast, primarily for electric generation load and for industrial demand, moving that gas to the Gulf Coast to be exported in the form of LNG, and even, as I said before, these growing exports to Mexico. An affiliate of INGA, the INGA Foundation, has published a series of studies beginning in 1999, and we're now on our sixth study, looking at the demand for North American pipeline infrastructure. And we released the last of those studies, the most recent of those studies, in 2014. You can see the results there. We expanded the scope of that study this last time to include crude oil and natural gas liquids pipeline infrastructure. And you might ask, why did we do that? And the reason is the interrelatedness of this, because I'm sure you have heard a lot of the reason for the growth of the gas supply has been the fact that in addition to the shale gas, you have got associated natural gas that comes with shale oil production. Also, you've got the fact that in some of the natural gas plays, the so-called wet plays, they are very rich with natural gas liquids. The natural gas liquids, at least historically, were priced on a parity with oil. And so it was very attractive for producers to develop those wet plays because of the uplift given by the liquids prices. So the recognition was that the driver for gas pipeline infrastructure also was somewhat interdependent on the drivers for the crude oil and the natural gas liquids infrastructure. Also, the INGA Foundation, the group that does this, the membership of that group is not just the pipeline companies, but really the whole supply chain that is involved in building and maintaining and repairing natural gas pipelines. And for a lot of those companies, the action on the crude oil and the liquid side was very, very important. Interestingly, and somewhat fortuitously, when we did the 2014 study, we decided to do a low demand case. And what did we pick as our driver for that low demand case? We said, what happens if crude oil prices go down? We didn't quite get it right on the amount they would go down. I think we said, well, they'd go from 100 to 75. But nonetheless, at least we captured that sensitivity to what happens if crude oil prices go down and what is the derivative effect on demand for pipeline capacity. You can see it there. Of course, the study made the assumption that that low price scenario continues over the course of the study horizon. As we all know, it remains to be seen how long-lived that will be, but nonetheless, it was something that we included in there. We're in the beginnings of doing the next iteration of that study. We anticipate that it will be out in the second quarter of 2016, and I would anticipate that even though we were a little bit prescient, and probably a little bit just lucky in terms of having the low growth case in there, I think that the impact of the current commodity price environment and the likelihood that that persists going forward is going to be a major factor as when we do the update to the study. Let me now talk a little bit about the regulatory regime for building gas pipelines and a little bit about kind of the economic and regulatory model for this industry. Gas pipelines are built in response to market demand. In particular, they are built when a shipper, a customer, is willing to sign a long-term contract for firm service. Unlike electric transmission, for instance, there is no regional planning or coordinated planning for pipelines. It is very much a competitive model where oftentimes there are multiple pipeline companies competing for a market opportunity, and the market really sorts it out in terms of where people sign those contracts. Also, it is not a build it and they will come model. And why is that? Well, think about it. These are capital-intensive, long-lived, immobile assets. It's not a railroad car that you can move to another market. It's not an airplane. It's not a ship or whatever. Also, this infrastructure, the rates for transporting on it are at cost-based rates set by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And also under FERC's pricing policies, new infrastructure is priced at its incremental rates are determined based on the incremental cost. So there is no rolling in, there is no cross-subsidization, and every project has got to stand on its own feet. It is a pretty extensive process to get an interstate pipeline approved by FERC. It begins with a lot of study by the proponent, a lot of market research in terms of whether the demand is out there, the pipeline will hold an open season to get the customers to enter non-binding commitments for the service. There's a pretty extensive pre-filing process that FERC has developed, with the idea being that a lot of the routing and environmental issues can be dealt with before the certificate application is filed, and also before you get into a situation where it's administrative litigation and all of the ex parte rules and things apply to it. Once you go through the pre-filing, you file at the FERC, and that process typically lasts probably 10 to 12 months, a pretty efficient process because you can work everything out ahead of time. And then construction can take 1 to 2 years, depending upon the magnitude of the project. And also, let's remember, if you're building in environmentally sensitive areas, you may have very limited windows of construction within which you can build during the year. While this is a long and involved process, I would say it is far superior to the processes from other forms of energy infrastructure. Certainly those who are trying to develop electric transmission lines or oil pipelines would love to have our process, which is a federal process, and also a process where if FERC grants the certificate, there is a federal right of eminent domain that comes with it. And while pipelines typically negotiate with most of the landowners, and it's resolved in that way, the ability to use the eminent domain for a few holdouts or whatever is a very significant leg up. FERC is not the only agency that participates in this process, though. While FERC has exclusive authority to site an interstate pipeline, there are a variety of other agencies that have got to issue various types of permits before the pipeline can be built. Delays in getting these permits has become a significant source of frustration in bringing these projects in on time. And what has become particularly frustrating is that while these permits are issued pursuant to federal law, in many cases the federal law lets the federal agency delegate it to a state agency. And when that happens, it tends to become a lot more politicized, a lot more parochial, and a lot more delays in that process. And this has been a real source of frustration. It's something that the Congress tried to address in the 2005 energy law, although the remedy that they put in place at that time has not proven to be very effective. As you're probably aware, pipelines have become a lot more controversial. And why is that? Well, I suggest there are two reasons. I mean, first of all, let's go back to what we talked about, the location of the Marcellus and the Utica. There's a lot more gas supply in the east. These are areas where, at least in recent history, there has not been a lot of pipeline development. There tends to be a greater population density, a very high level of environmental consciousness. So clearly there are the issues affecting landowners and local communities. And in some ways, I think this is really a variation of the issues that historically pipelines have dealt with. What is new is that pipelines have become a part of a much bigger debate over climate change, fossil fuels, opposition to hydraulic fracturing. And I think the pipelines have become